I'm very excited about Katherine, the Wright sister. Another amazing story about a woman that we've never heard of, and we should have heard of because she very likely changed history. And I think in the case of Katherine, changed history very much for the positive. I think every school child has heard of Orville and Wilbur Wright, the inventors of the airplane, right? Everybody knows, and Kitty Hawk, they flew for the first time, powered flight. But we're never taught about Katherine. And Katherine was their baby sister, and Katherine was critical to them being able to do it, both in advising, not so much in the technical part, because the boys, as she called them, did that, but just sort of an outside observer and troubleshooting when they just couldn't figure things out. And sometimes it was just step back and look at the big picture. She was always there for that. She also helped manage their bicycle shop, which was their livelihood while they're inventing the airplane. And she also worked as a school teacher, again, to support the family. The Wrights were not a wealthy family. They basically raised $1,000 on their own through their bicycle shop to build the airplane. And that was their budget. They borrowed from no one. They just did it on their own. And Katherine was there every step of the way, advising, sourcing materials when they had to, for example, find fabric for the wings. She did the research and found the perfect fabric from France, actually, and later the US. So sourcing materials and supporting the family, supporting them, doing the writing when they had to contact people. All those were critical and helped them do the invention. And then probably even more important was after they had already flown Kitty Hawk, and then they went back to Dayton and they further developed the airplane. Then they needed to sell it to somebody, right? And the Americans were still not quite sure they were flying. They kind of thought it was fake news, to use a modern term, because so many had tried and failed, and all everybody remembered was the pictures of the crashes and the crashes and crashes, and they just didn't really think, this time was really happening. So they actually went to Europe and sold the airplane there. At the same time, they were selling to the US Army too. But it was Katherine who went to the businessmen and the prime ministers and the kings and the queens and the princes and the captains of industry. She taught herself, or knew partially how to speak French, taught herself fluent enough to describe in very technical detail exactly what they were doing. She had the personality to go out there and speak to everybody, parades of people. Orville and Wilbur, neither one of them were public speakers. Historians now say if they were alive today, they might actually describe them as being on the spectrum. That they were I mean, they were brilliant, but that was not a skill they had. It was Katherine who did that all. And then by the time they came back from Europe, they were already famous in Europe, and they became famous in the US. But then, Katherine stepped back into her role. She didn't go back to teaching because she didn't have time, but she became an officer in their company, and that's pretty much why they're famous. Both Katherine and their father, who they refer to as the bishop, cautioned them continually about, don't put things out there until you have this patent. And then, and so they basically kind of stopped flying between the years of about 1905 and 1908, as they got the patents in place. But it's Katherine and the bishop, as I said, who actually also hired lawyers to make sure that they were covered and making sure they were listening to some crazy advice. Here's a little piece of advice they got that they did listen to. It wasn't their nature. I mean, especially Wilbur was like, but this was an effort from so many scientists. I mean, they learned from people before them, and they kind of thought of it as a community effort, but you can't live on that. And they did things that were distinctly theirs. And so they did learn through family pressure too, because I think Katherine and the bishop were kind of tired of supporting the family at this point. Need some help here. But one thing they did listen to, which I kind of find fascinating was that they knew where there were spies, right? Especially Curtis, who became famous in aviation as well. He was one of the people who they got into lawsuits many times with, and the Wright brothers did prevail. They knew that he had sent spies out, and when they were working on the flyers in Dayton, in Huffman Prairie, in Dayton, they could kind of see people. You could ride the trolley out there, and people come, they'd see them with the cameras, and then they'd chase them off and everything. Well, they got advice, believe it or not, from a beekeeper who had patents himself. He was he had written patents because he had invented certain beehives, right? And he just had this fascination with aviation. So he and Katherine were kind of watching it and talking about it. And he said, "Do you know what that?" They had built an aluminum block engine, one of the first of its kind, really, because it was light enough, right? And that just stands out like aluminum, right? So he said, you need to disguise that because you can see it from 200 yards away, and they're going to capture it, and they're going to steal your engine, which was a huge part of what they were doing. Like, oh, okay. So and it's a fun scene in the book where I have Orville cooking in Catherine's kitchen, cooking up some paint. But they painted the engine black. And you can see that engine actually at the Engineers Club in Dayton, Ohio now. In 1908, when Wilbur was doing demonstrations for the Europeans trying to sell the airplane, she was not the first woman to go up in a plane. She was actually the third and the second one that Wilbur had taken off, because she was in the States with Orville, who nearly died, and she had another one of her big roles, and she rescued Orville from dying. But anyway, she went over there, and I don't know that she was absolutely terrified, but I got the feeling from just some of her things that it was not something she was just sort of dying to do, because they had been flying since 1903, right? And it wasn't until 1908 when they needed her publicity wise to go up in the plane, because here they're trying to tell everybody in Europe that flying is safe. It's no more risky than riding your horse across the field, and it's so safe. And Katherine, by now, had become quite famous. I mean, everybody knew her. She was in the papers. There's lots of papers. And yet, guess who had never gone up in a plane? So it got to be to the point where she needed to do it, and she did. So it's a fun scene in the book.